Hello, everybody. What I'm going to do now is just kind of walk you through the PowerPoint presentation that we would have done on Tuesday if I had been able to come to class. And so what we're going to handle today is talking about the second, third, and fourth Piagetian stages. So previously, you guys in your online week had learned about the sensory motor stage, and that's the stage that happens between roughly 0 to 2 years old. The next stage is what's called pre-operational thought, and that's roughly between 2 and 7. When I say roughly, I do mean roughly. There's a lot of controversy about whether or not Piaget was exactly on the mark in terms of the age parameters that he had thought that children had these different stages with. And so you want to use these as just kind of rough approximations. After that is concrete operations, which is thought to go roughly from 7 to any place between 11 and 15. Originally, Piaget had said 11 and then later revised that to be 15. And then formal operations, which is thought to happen anytime between 11/15 onward through the rest of one's life. Piaget thought that formal operations was the final adult kind of version of cognition. So we're going to start first with pre-operational thought, the time period, the thought that happens in that basically the end of toddlerhood up through the early school years up to around age 7. And that's a type of thought characterized by errors. There are 3 major categories of errors. One's called egocentrism, then semi-logical thinking, and then rigidity of thought. Rigidity of thought actually breaks down to a couple of subcategories itself. But first, let's begin with the initial one, egocentrism. When Piaget was talking about egocentrism, he was not talking about narcissism. A lot of people hear that term and think narcissism. That wasn't what he was thinking. He felt egocentrism was a marked difficulty in taking another person's perspective, from understanding that someone else sees things differently than you see it. So his classical task for examining that in children was something called the 3 mountains task, in which, as the picture illustrated, he would have a young child stand on one side of a table in which there would be 3 mountains, the largest of which was closest to the child, essentially obstructing the child's view of the smaller 2 mountains. And then he would place a doll on the other side, much like you see in this picture. And the doll, if you were in the doll's seat and could see things as the doll could, you would see all 3 mountains because you'd see the smallest one right in front of you, then the intermediate one, and then the largest one. And then Piaget would ask the child, have the child stand just where you see in the picture and say, what can you see? And the child would say, well, I see just one big mountain, because from their side of the table, the big mountain obstructs everything else. And then Piaget would ask the child, who was in pre-operational thought, what do you think the doll sees? And the child in pre-operational thought would say, the doll sees one big mountain, assuming that the doll would see it just as they saw it. When in reality, from the doll's perspective, you can see all 3 mountains, the little one, the intermediate one, and then the big one. But young children in the pre-operational stage had such difficulty putting themselves in another person's position or seeing things from another person's view that they would just assume that the way that they saw things was the way the other person might see it also. Now, for those of you who are interested in adult psychopathology, as we go through this and talk about some of these errors, I want you not just to think of them developmentally in terms of younger kids having them, but also to think about them in terms of what types of psychopathology might people have the difficulties that we're discussing. So in what kind of adult psychopathology might you see people struggling with understanding things from a different perspective? So if we think about, and for each of these ones, we're going to talk about what this is what it looks like in terms of cold, hard cognition first, and then shift the lens over to what that might mean in terms of clinical implications. So if you have a lot of difficulty understanding other people's perspective or seeing it from perspective from someone else's shoes, that's going to result in some real problems in terms of your cooperativeness, your ability to resolve conflict. So for example, I can't tell you the number of clinicians that I've seen talking to young kids in pre-operational thought who will say things like, Johnny, how do you think Ricky felt when you grabbed his toy away from him? And Johnny will stand there and be silent. because Johnny doesn't have the slightest clue how Ricky felt, because he is in pre-operational thought, and he doesn't really have the ability to put himself in Ricky's shoes and think about that. A better way as a clinician to respond to somebody in this stage cognitively might be to say, Johnny, how would you feel if Ricky grabbed the toy away from you? And Johnny's going to answer, well, I'd be mad. And then to enlighten Johnny that that's probably how Ricky felt when you grabbed the toy from him. Because that is not asking him to put himself in a perspective take, which is cognitively pretty difficult for him because he's in pre-operational thought, but instead manages to clue him in via another route by explaining to him that Ricky would feel the same way that he feels. This difficulty taking another person's perspective is something that you're going to see really pronounced prior to the age of 5, and then you'll see it, like many Piagetian tasks, you'll see it slowly begin to get better before coming to an ability to understand another person's perspective when the child is a little bit older, after age 7 or so. It's not like individuals change Piagetian tasks on a dime. There is a period of transition. Remember from your previous slides, a horizontal décollage, because Piaget was French and had a cool name for it. But that really means just a period of coming into being, where the individual is slowly beginning to get the idea, but isn't able to really embrace it fully or always understand it. So during that period of coming into being, where the child is starting to get the idea that other people think differently or see things differently than they might see it, they may have some realization of that, but not really see the other person's perspective as equally valid. So like even with this picture here that you see illustrated in the PowerPoint, there may be some realization that the child who is in front has maybe the right of way, but not really when it comes down to it. That their own view, even though they realize the child who's going first may have felt like they should have gone first and should be able to go across the little playground equipment first. But when the child behind in the blue shirts view comes into conflict with that idea, then they assume that one of those ideas must be incorrect, and the one that must be incorrect is the one the other person has, not their own. In terms of other clinical corollaries of that, if you feel that other people's perspectives are not equally valid as yours, then your motivation to compromise may be particularly low, not out of a sense of willfulness, which is many people assume when young kids don't want to cooperate or share, but more out of an inability to appreciate that the other person's perspective is legitimate, and as legitimate as their own. Another implication, kind of clinically, of the egocentric view of the world and that kind of cognition is that often the individual speaks in a way that does not contain sufficient reference for the other person to fully understand what they're saying. So you'll sometimes talk to younger kids who will say, well, then I gave this to her and she said that, as if you would automatically know what this and her and she and that referred to. Which is often fairly difficult for other people to do. You see a little bit of this. I don't know how many people have given Rorschach's. I'm trying to remember where you guys, if you end up doing that in your assessment class here or not. But the Rorschach, the way it's designed is first you give all the cards to the individual and they come up with what they say they see in the cards. And then you actually go back through all the Rorschach cards, and with the preface of saying that you want to understand it and see it as that person sees it. So to have them explain to you how they saw whatever they saw in the card. Rorschach you can technically give to children up to all the way down to age 5. But if you actually look at the Rorschach tables, kids who are down in that 5 and 6 and 7 range show up a lot on what's called special scores on the Rorschach, which are normally indicative of psychotic symptomatology. And that's because they often have difficulty with both logical reasoning, which we'll talk about in a few moments, but they also have difficulty with the very essence of the task, which is helping another person to see it as they see it, because that also requires some degree of perspective taking. So often their language is not contain enough reference for the person who is taking the notes on the reference to really understand how they're seeing what they're seeing in the card. So, as I mentioned, there's the issue of semi-logical thinking, which is the second major error that you see in pre-operational thought. And that's this notion that thoughts are linked together in a loose way instead of in a truly logical relationship. So the child who says, I nap in the afternoon and I haven't had a nap, so it can't be afternoon. And when you initially hear that that could sound a little logical, and then you realize it's got a hole so big you could drive a truck through it. I mean, just because you didn't get your nap that afternoon doesn't mean that all time and space stopped and it's no longer afternoon. You see that in the little cartoon here. My finger stopped bleeding. I must be out of blood. That seems like it's an attempt at logic, but it's what's called semi-logical reasoning. It doesn't really adhere to the rules of logic. And so children who are in pre-operational thought often have cognition that does not exactly adhere to the rules of logic. If you think about this, individuals who are older, who are depressed, for instance, often engage in semi-logical thinking. So they may see themselves as at fault for things that it's no way they could possibly really have been at fault for. And yet they really strongly feel that they're to blame for that. That would be an example of semi-logical thinking. They're not really following the rules of logic. So for children, you particularly see this semi-logical thinking with that kind of attribution notion. And so children will often have this belief that if I think it, it happens. So I had a case once with a kid who was really angry at their little brother, which is what the examples here is about. And that afternoon, he was injured, and there was this sense of the kid felt that it was his fault because he had wished his brother would go away, and then his brother was injured, and therefore it must have been his fault because he wished it had happened. And this is the beginning of what we'll talk about. In many ways, kids often struggle. This kind of thinking, pre-operational thinking, can lead them in the face of traumatic experiences to be very self-blaming. And that's something that as a clinician, we're working with younger children who experience trauma, is really important to understand. So let's kind of talk about some of the other implications of semi-logical thinking. One of them is called, in conjunction with egocentrism, this notion of animism. Animism means that basically the individual assumes that inanimate objects or animals have all the properties that a typical alive human being would have, right? So thoughts, feelings, behaviors. This is why Toy Story works, because younger kids, and we all were younger kids once, assumed that, stuffed animals and toys could actually think and feel and act. And so one of the very first things that we talked about in the class, the very first one, I'd given you guys the example of the two sisters who had thought that their teddy bear was talking to them. So that would be an example of what's called animism. They were a little old, though, to have that belief, and that was part of the concern and made part of the question about whether or not is this psychosis for that particular case, or is this a case of delayed cognition, and you're still seeing some animism. So the last one, so we've talked about whether or not the individual was egocentric thought. We've talked about whether or not there was some semi-logical thinking. And the last one of the pre-operational errors is called rigidity in thought. And as I've mentioned before, this one really breaks down into a total of 4 subcategories. The first is called centration. And then there's focus on states and focus on appearance. Those two kind of go together a little bit. And something called lack of reversibility. So let's kind of walk our way through those. Centration is a tendency to focus on one and only one salient feature of an object or event and to ignore all others. Conservation, in contrast, is understanding that the underlying properties of an object don't change even if the appearance does. So let's examine these in a bit more. Piaget had a series of tasks that he would have young children do to show whether or not they understood the very tasks that we were talking about their centration, their ability to understand, to focus on multiple features of an event at a time, and also their ability to understand conservation. So we're going to watch a couple of videos here briefly. They're old ones, I'll tell you now, because they have the traditional Piagetian tasks in them. you'll see the children really struggle with what you'll see the diagram here. Initially, they are looking at two glasses of water that have other colored water that are of the same height, and they're in containers that are exactly the same. Then the experimenter, as you'll see in a moment, will pour one of those glasses into a tall graduated cylinder, which is taller but narrower, and then ask the child if there is the same amount of water in the tall, narrow one, C, as there is in A. Now, having just said that A and B have the same amount of water, most adults would say, well, of course, A and C now have the same amount of water. But younger children, you'll see, will really struggle with this. They will think that C has more. And that is because, as we just talked about with our centration notion here, that focusing on one and only one salient feature, the young children will just focus on the height of the graduated cylinder, and they'll say, oh, well, C has more because it's taller, and not be able to combine that with the idea that C is not only taller, but it's narrower, and so therefore it's the same amount of fluid. So let's look at that for a moment. So let's start thinking about clinical implications of centration. If you think that you can only really focus on one and only one aspect of a task at a time, that makes preschoolers in particular, or kids even beginning to enter school age, think that if you make one change, it should change an overall situation. So if I change one thing, then everything else should change. You sometimes see this paralleled in adults even. So think of a case that you might have had at some point where an individual is an alcoholic and in a family system. And the thought is, well, if they can just get them to stop drinking, then everything in the family will be fine. And in reality, that will be an important element, but it won't make everything in the family fine. There's a number of probably other issues going on simultaneously that have developed, perhaps as a result of the alcoholism, perhaps predated it. But there's often expectations that if we change this one thing, everything in the family will be perfect. And that would be an example of centration, even though it's more at an adult level. It's a similar kind of dynamic, which is this theme that we're talking about here, that even though this Piaget has designed this to talk about cognition in young children, and it very much does that, it exemplifies that cognition in this age range from 2 to 7. In psychopathology in adults, you often see individuals who will operate in ways that seem very much like this pre-operational thought. It also makes another clinical implication of centration is difficulty understanding that you can hold two emotions simultaneously. So young children who are in pre-operational thought will really struggle with the idea that they can have different feelings at the same time, so that you can love your dad, but also be really mad that he left to go live in a different house. That it's often very difficult for younger children in this age range to be able to combine those two feelings at the same time. If we're going to move up into the adult end and think psychopathology, where might we see something like this mirrored into, we could think of borderline psychopathology, where often there's a all good, all bad kind of perspective, but it's difficult for individuals to hold a differentiated view of another that combines contradictory emotions. And then, as we mentioned, this rigidity of thought has a total of 4 subcategories. So our first was centration, and the next is the two that I'd said go together, a focus on current state and a focus on current appearance. And both of these go together because they really stress the way in which perception pulls the individual more than logic. So focus on current state is as it sounds. You're focused on what's happening right now. A focus on appearance is also a similar kind of construct, such that you're really focused on what you're seeing right in front of you, not necessarily what is logically happens. So if an adult significantly changes their appearance, the child may be confused if it's the same person. And then you really also see these both appearing in tasks of what are called conservation of length and area, in which they'll present the child with either lengths or with areas, and we'll see in a moment some illustration of that are actually equal, but the child is pulled away by the current appearance of that one looks shorter than the other, or one looks not as plentiful as the other, and goes with the appearance, and even though it doesn't really make much logical sense. So let's look at an example of that. Conservation of length, these two lines are exactly the same, but obviously one of them, the bottom one, is is slanted downward somewhat. So a pre-operational child will say that the line on the top is longer. Even if you put the bottom line up so that it is parallel and equal, and then in front of them move it down, so that they, again, kind of mirroring the task that you saw with the liquids, in which they see them both equal and they see one shifted down, but they'll still say that the top line is longer. Another one is the following one, which is a conservation of area task, and this is often presented in the form of a little bit of a playful example in which they'll pull out a little tiny miniature horse and say that these are two fields for the horse to graze in, and that the farmer is putting some farm buildings on the field too. So on each field, the farmer puts a total of 8 buildings. I mean, there are 8 blocks on each of those green things. And they'll ask the child, well, in which field does the horse have more to graze with? And I think even as adults, it's hard not to feel that the one on the right has more grass for the horse to graze in. But the reality is that there are 8 blocks of both the same size on each of those green rectangles there. And so both what's on your left and on your right has exactly the same amount of green space. But even as adults, we're somewhat drawn to seeing the one on the right as having more grass. Now, what are some of the clinical implications of a focus on states and appearance? One is that preschoolers have difficulty understanding that you can feel, that you can show yourself as feeling one way but really feel a different way. So a person can be smiling but angry on the inside. That is a very difficult kind of task for a preschooler to be able to manage. So counterfactual information is often hard for them. So a lot of times adults will say, well, what would have happened if Johnny were mad, if you told Johnny you were mad instead of hitting him? You can imagine many adults kind of working with a kid who's engaged in some aggression and saying something like that. But that's asking the child to understand something different from the current state that is happening, which was an appearance that wasn't what happened. Sometimes you do a little bit better if you have a child who has difficulty understanding counterfactual information, if you can couch it in the future, because it doesn't seem like it's directly pulling away from their current perception. So saying, what might happen if the next time, you were mad at Johnny, you told him you were mad instead of hitting him. But it's often, even with that adjustment, it's still often difficult for young kids to grasp that kind of concept, what's called counterfactual. Another clinical implication of the focus on current states and appearances is that young children do not tend to focus on the underlying psychological causes for events. Not to mid to late childhood do young children understand that psychological traits are stable, enduring characteristics that continue on across situations and over time. So younger children will use words that sound like trait words. So they'll say somebody is shy, or somebody is, considerate or kind. So these things that appear like they're traits, but they don't understand the word to mean what we think of when we use those words as an adult. As an adult, if we say someone's shy, we expect that shy trait, that tendency to pull back from others, to be something that lasts throughout a good portion of their life, that's present in a variety of different settings, and that is something that's very central to their being. Young children don't understand it that way. They think shy is just a descriptor for the moment. So if you may hear them using those words, but they don't apply the same kind of trait meaning to them, even if they use it. So young children generally don't focus much on that underlying trait or psychological causes for events. Instead, they focus on the surface, what they see. So a clinical implication of that is they focus on outcomes instead of intentions. So if you present to a young child the example of this child broke 10 cups trying to help his mom. He was trying to help his mom put away stuff and be very helpful to her, and he accidentally bumped into the drain rack, and all these cups fell over and broke. Versus, a child who was mad at his mom, picked up one cup and just smashed it to the floor. And you'll ask children, well, which child did the worst thing? And they'll say the child who broke 10 cups. Because they're really not taking into account that the first one was an accident. The child was actually trying to do something very nice and be very helpful. Those motives really aren't part of their reasoning. And instead, they're just looking at one, broken cup versus 10 broken cups. The last of the original three errors that we're talking about with pre-operational thought is something called the lack of reversibility. And this kind of brings us back to our water task that you'd seen earlier. And that is one of the ways that children can understand that task is they can mentally in their head, after the water's been poured into the tall graduated cylinder C, mentally go back and re-pour it back into B and say, okay, well, if I took this water out of this tall, skinny container and poured it back into B, it would be just the same as it was before. That's called reversibility. And young children who are pre-operational lack that ability to reverse something back mentally in their mind. So what are kind of the implications of that? One is if you can't reverse back, it impairs your ability to problem solve. Because instead of saying, okay, well, let's figure out if I went back 3 steps and then did things differently, how would it have been? And if you can't go back 3 steps and reverse back that way, it's very difficult for you to use that kind of problem solving strategy. So attempting to use that kind of problem solving strategy with younger kids will be problematic because they won't really understand it very well. Piaget talked about something called heteronomous morality, which between 5 and 10, where the child regards rules handed down by authority as unchangeable, and autonomous morality between 10 and 12, which is the growing realization that moral rules are social conventions that can be changed by people in society. And really that kind of is a little bit of a combination of many of the things that we've talked about being able to see another person's perspective, about not being overly focused on current states, and really taking into account intentions more. So putting it all together, these errors that we've talked about, the tendency to, or egocentrism, the tendency towards semiological thinking, and then the rigidity ones, the centration, the focus on appearance and states, the inability to reverse back, they lead young children to use an attributional style that assumes that the causes of events, particularly we're thinking here traumatic events, because that's going to have a lot of clinical implications, or something that's related to them, something concrete, and something that was both proximal and temporally linked with the event. So what I mean there is something that happened just before and really close to the event. So why do you think your parents are getting a divorce? Because I got into a fight at school last week and my teacher called my parents. So it's something about me, that's that egocentrism, right? It's that focus on current states. It's something that happened last week. It's that something that it was a fight, very concrete, not a focus on underlying issues. The real reason your parents are getting a divorce probably has to do with their incompatibility, or one of your parents' psychopathology or substance use or whatever, or the fact that your one parent has a midlife crisis, whatever the components are. But it's not probably the fact that the child got into a fight the previous week and the teacher called the parents. But yet young children often come up with those attributions because of that, particularly that egocentric component, that tendency to assume it's something about me because I only see things from my perspective. Makes children very vulnerable to self-blaming for traumatic events. So for my master's thesis many years ago was on young children's attributions for their own abuse. How do kids make sense of the fact that their parents maltreat them? How do they kind of make sense of that in their head? And I was always amazed at the amount in which young children would twist logically in a pretzel to come up with reasons for why their parent did these kind of horrific acts to them that did not attribute the problem to the parent. So why do you think your dad beat you? Because I spilled my milk at dinner. That's something about me that's proximal and temporal. I spilled my milk at dinner right before. The real reason that their father beat them is because he had anger management problems and substance abuse issues and all these other things, and because he had, was a very angry, kind of hostile person. But those are things that are not how that child thinks, because they involve him taking another person's perspective and understanding it from his dad's perspective. They involve things like traits, like he's an angry man, that's a trait, and they don't really understand traits. They involve that kind of attribution that your dad is an angry man also requires them to pull away from the very current, what's current and appearances, and all that is very difficult. And it also, if you notice that you see also the component of it only has one note to it. So that's the centration, not taking in multiple factors. There's probably many reasons that fed into why the father maltreated the child, but the child really only comes up with one. If the one they're going to come up with, it's going to involve themselves. It's going to be something that happened just before hand, and it's going to be something fairly concrete. And that often means that they end up blaming themselves. So parents frequently will ask me things like, well, should we tell the kids that we're thinking of getting a divorce? And my response is always like, well, the kids know, first of all, that, because kids inevitably know when parents don't think they know. I mean, this is their world. They're very savvy about it. They're really focused on what's happening with their parents. And so they probably have already figured that out. And the moment they figured that out, they come up with an attribution. Because if you've ever been around younger kids who are under the age of 7, they continually ask why. Everything's a why. Why, is the sun, shining today? Why is the sky blue? Why can't I hang from the ceiling lights? Young kids have an urge to come up with a reason for things. That's very much characteristic of this age period. But because of pre-operational thought, the reason they come up with is something about them, something that happened right beforehand, and something that's very current, kind of temporally tied and concrete. And so if you don't tell them, wow, supply an attribution like mom and dad are having a difficult time, and because we have difficulty getting on the same page and we argue a lot, we've decided that we want to separate. If you don't give them that attribution, they're going to know the event's happening, and they're going to supply their own attribution for it. And that attribution is one that's not going to do them any good. It's going to be a self-blaming one. And as a clinician, it is so much harder to go in there and dig out that attribution once it's been constructed in the kid's head than it is to supply the kid with a different attribution that is not a self-blaming one from the get-go. So that tendency parents have not to want to talk about things with kids often, unfortunately, at this age range, can end up backfiring on them because they think they're shielding the child. But in reality, the child often gets wind of what's going on beforehand and supplies their own attribution, and that's not one that does the child any favors because it's a self-blaming one. And then it's much more difficult to dig that out than if the parent had discussed it earlier on with the child and provided them when they discussed it with an attribution that did not involve the child. So when children get to be about 7 or 8, they make a transition over out of pre-operational thought into what's called concrete operations. Probably the biggest aspect to understand about concrete operations is the very first bullet up there, or even before the bullet, corrects the errors of pre-operational thought. That's really what the essence of this period is about. So children, when they hit concrete operations, which start about 7 to 8, they can start to mentally reverse operations. They have conservation. They understand that the properties of an object don't change when the appearance does. They can decenter, meaning they can understand that there's more than one aspect to be considered. They can also do something called classification, which is the ability to group objects based on a trait. That's what you see at the top illustration there. Put all the blue flowers together, all the yellowy orange flowers together. They have seriation, which is just a fancy word for saying they can order objects based on a trait. So this little girl in the second picture is ordering the blocks based on height. And they had transivity, which is, again, a probably overly esoteric word to basically just say that they're able to compare how two objects relate, and from that have an understanding how a third object might relate. So they can understand, if we look at the bottom picture on the right, that the child understands A is shorter than B, so the yellow one's shorter than the red, and B is shorter than C. So the red bar is shorter than the green bar. So because A is shorter than B and B is shorter than C, that must mean that A is shorter than C. That's really what transivity means. So the second set of ones here. So the first set is we're more familiar with reversibility, conservation, understand the properties of an object don't change when the appearance does, and decentering, which just means keeping multiple kind of arrows going into something, understand there's more important to consider more than one aspect. And on the second one, we understand that there's a lot of technical terms to talk about what are actually more simplistic concept, which is the child can understand how to group objects based on a trait, can understand how to order objects based on a trait, and can understand when you compare two objects together, if they have a relationship, then they can understand how the third object relates to it too. That's going to be during that whole time period between roughly 7, 8, up to originally Piaget had said 11, but 15 really became the marker that he revised that to. Once children hit that point in adolescence, the beginning of adolescence, early to mid-adolescence, they'll transition into what Piaget thought was the final stage of cognition, which is really characteristic of adult cognition according to Piaget, and that is formal operations. Here, thought changes again fairly dramatically. So each of these stages, the way the child thinks is really quite different. So when you hit formal operations, individuals engage in thought that is very logical, and related to that, they engage in something called hypodeductive reasoning, which is the ability to develop hypotheses to explain a phenomena, to generate hypotheses, to systematically devise tests to confirm or refute hypotheses. This is almost like, think of hypodeductive reasoning as the scientific method. Their thought becomes much more complex and combinatory. Combinatory thought means taking multiple factors into account, and it becomes quite a bit more abstract. And so I'm going to watch a little bit of a video at this point on the formal operational child, so you can get a feel for how the concrete operational child differs from the formal one. And I think that video does a really nice job, particularly when they ask about the issue of what would be the implications of, being left-handed, and you really get the concrete operational child having very simplistic, and as the name suggests, concrete view of the advantages of that. And then the other formal operation child is talking about how the whole world would change and how perspectives change for the thumb and the left-handedness there. So you really see a very much more complex thought, like we were talking about, a much more abstract view. And what are the clinical implications of that? One is an educational one. Individuals are much more able to focus on math and science because of that hypodeductive reasoning. I mean, that's really the scientific method, and that's going to help a lot when you hit more advanced science. Their problem solving becomes more systematic and planned. Again, that's the hypodeductive. They understand how events are interacting and how things can be multiply determined. That's that combinatory logic. And there's a much greater focus on the future. And this is going to become really important when we talk about adolescence. Adolescents in formal operations often have developed very idealistic and passionate approaches to abstract issues, politics, religions. They become very focused on that. The thought is that the adolescent suddenly realizes, I can think abstractly. And in that ability to think abstractly, and hypothetically, they can imagine a future that's different from the one that they're living now, a life that can be different. And that's thought to be very important also in identity development, being able to imagine a future ideal self that you want to aspire to. In terms of having more longer-term future focus, in terms of being passionate about abstract concepts. So the implications of having that ability to think abstractly and in a future hypothetical way are really manyfold and have strong implications in terms of the individual's socio-emotional functioning. So how did Piaget thought that you moved between these stages? He thought you did the transitions between the 4 Piagetian stages, in part through maturation, when your physical features, including your central nervous system, was ready, in part by physical experience, particularly the transition out of the sensory motor to the pre-operational by having that physical contact with the world in which you were extracting laws. He thought some of the transition people moved into the higher stages as they got older because of some social elements, such as the language and also interaction with other people. But he felt that the main vehicle for why you transitioned into one of the stages was a lack of equilibrium. So the lack of balance between assimilation, remember when you kind of incorporate things into your already pre-existing cognitive view, and we talked about that the previous week, and a combination in which you're going to change your view to fit the current situation that you're encountering. Now, there are a lot of criticisms of Piaget that have been developed over time, and many of them quite legitimate. Piaget really doesn't talk about what happens cognitively after adolescence. It's kind of, according to Piaget, you get up to adolescence and that's it, as if your cognitive abilities and skills don't change any for the rest of your life, which is probably fairly unrealistic. Piaget assumed all adults moved into formal operation, and the reality is that not all formal adults not all adults actually function in formal operations. Personally, I don't think any of us always want to be held up to the standard of being in formal operation. As we've talked about previously, in psychopathology, it seems that individuals do often exhibit characteristics that are more consistent with earlier stages, particularly pre-operational thought. Piaget seemed to give a lot more credit in that early sensory motor stage to motor than sensory. That was a lot more about doing things rather than perceiving. The tasks that you kind of saw in some of the videos are very multiply determined. So when you move the water into the tall graduated cylinder, you base your assessment of whether the child is in pre-operational or concrete operations, not just by which one they say has more, but by their explanation for it. So you're really assessing linguistic skills just as much as you're assessing any type of cognitive skill. And a lot of people felt that, well, then which one are you really saying is driving the ship here? Piaget felt and strongly felt that the sequence he had put forth was universal, but there's some question about that. If other cultures, it appears to have some complexity of language, but also have complexity of cognition, but maybe it doesn't always take the form that Piaget kind of envisioned for formal operation. And then there's been real criticism about whether or not Piaget is, quote unquote, off on the ages. So in particular, looking at the last two, the universal component, about 30 to 40% of adults in developed countries use formal operations regularly, which means that 70 to 60% of adults don't use formal operations. So if Piaget imagined this as something that happened between 11 and 15, that doesn't really explain why your average adult is probably not using formal operations at any given moment. And then, as I mentioned also just a moment ago, while increasing complexity of thought does seem to be associated cross-culturally with the appearance of adolescence, cultures, the form that increased complexity takes on varies by culture. So Piaget really emphasized a scientific reasoning kind of notion, really focused on abstract and future, and that may be very much more culturally determined how much those individual factors relate. The thought does appear to become more complex, but whether or not it's always that hypodeductive reasoning component to it, or whether or not it strongly emphasizes future, or whether or not it strongly emphasizes abstract, that seems to be much more varied among individual cultures. And then the other criticism near the end was this notion of that the ages are off. Later research often said the skills came in earlier. So Ballergun has this interesting experiment with 3 to 4 months old where she shows that they indicate surprise when an object disappears from the array. And according to Piaget, object permanence at 3 to 4 months old is out of sight, out of existence. So the counter argument of that is that, a lot of people say, well, just because the infant looks surprised when the object is gone doesn't mean that they know the object continues to exist, even if it's out of their visual field. So a lot of the earlier experience that seem to counter Piaget's timetable do require a fair amount of inference. So a good example of that is the next one that I'm going to mention, which is the theory of the mind component. So there was a rather famous study done in the late 90s that looked at 14 to 18-month-old infants and had them taste a broccoli and goldfish. Actually, it had the experimenter taste them, not the children. So the experimenter would take a piece of broccoli and go, and just really like, oh, this is so good, I love this to the broccoli. And to the goldfish, they would go, ew, and they'd make a terrible, disgusted face and look like, they hated the goldfish, kind of like, your worst awful face. And then the adult would put out their hand, they put the bowl of broccoli and the bowl of goldfish in front of the 14 and 18-month-old infants, and they'd say, please give me some, but not define which some. So it was up to the infant to decide whether or not to give them broccoli or goldfish. And the authors reasoned that if the child gave the adult broccoli, it indicated the child could infer the mental state of the adult. They could put themselves in the adult's shoes, because the adult said yum, 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 yum at broccoli, and they assumed that, oh, this adult really likes broccoli. I can understand things from their perspective, so I'm going to give them broccoli. So first, let's look at what the experiment results were, which is that 2/3 of the 14-month-olds and about 30% of the 18-month-olds just stood there or sat there when they asked to please give me some, because they didn't give them anything. So that left them with a total N for the study of 26 children, which is hard to make a whole lot of anything out of because that's not very many kids. And of the children who responded, 69% of the 18-month-olds offered the adult broccoli, and only 13% of the 14-month-olds did. And the investigators from that concluded that 18-month-olds can infer another person's desire, even if it's different from their own. So they can essentially put themselves into the shoes of another. So the question here is, what other conclusions might one draw from this data? So if you think about it, there are a lot of different conclusions you could draw from this data, right? One could be that the child secretly likes the goldfish and feels that everybody must like the goldfish. And since the investigator hasn't specified what they want, they're going to unload the broccoli on them so that there's more goldfish for themselves. They could be giving the investigator the broccoli because they want to see the investigator make the yum, 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 yum noise. There are a number of different reasons why these results, as tenuous as they are, because so many kids didn't respond, could be the way they are, besides that an 18-month-old can infer theory of the mind and understand things from another person's perspective. And as we talked about at the beginning of class, that often with these early experiments, you need to be kind of careful to look at the inferences that the authors are drawing before kids are verbal, because sometimes the inferences seem like they go a little far. And this would be an example of this. This particular study has often been used as a criticism to say that Piaget, was off on the ages that children could understand another person's perspective much, much earlier than Piaget thought, because Piaget is thinking that's not happening until after 7, 8. And here you have these 1.5-year-old kids at 18 months who understand theory of the mind, but that means that you believe this experiment really illustrates theory of the mind, or the ability to take another person's perspective. And there's, I think, some legitimate question about that. So this was by far the longer of the two PowerPoints. The other PowerPoint we're going to watch is quite a bit shorter, and that's the other component that I want to kind of just go through to help catch us up.